So we know the Bible is full of esoteric knowledge, as I talk about. But when you study Sumerian history, the question you ask yourself is, how is it that the Sumerians can be, so old? The history could be so old. How is it we don't find the Sumerians in the Bible? How is it the Bible is not talking about the ancient Sumerians? So I know people are going to say, isn't it talking about the Sumerians in the book of Genesis, chapter 11, when it's talking about the land of Shinar? And Shinar translates into Babel, which, Babylon. So one of the things I like to do when we get words like this is always go back to Codex Sinaiticus, because you want to try to establish if it's really talking about the Sumerians or the Babylonians. And we know, it's the Tower Babel. So even when you go to Codex Sinaiticus, we only get, it's supposed to be like 8 different translations or 8 times that Shinar is mentioned in the Bible. We only really see it once in Codex Sinaiticus, and it's not saying the same thing as it says in Isaiah 11:11. You go to Isaiah 11:11 in the Codex Sinaiticus, and we do find it there, and we find the word as you can see here, which supposedly translates into Babel, meaning Babylon, which we know Babel means, it means speech. So when you go into the other verses, which Genesis is supposed to be mentioned, also in the book of Daniel, which is not in Codex Sinaiticus, by the way. Zecharia, we go there and we can see here where it's supposed to be. You don't see that same word in Zecharia, so it's not there where it's supposed to be. Also supposed to be mentioned in the book of Joshua, and it's not there when you look in Codex Sinaiticus. So we got to understand, as I always say, Sinaiticus, which is the oldest complete biblical manuscript written in Greek, it's not the same as the King James Version. This stuff was changed for a reason. Now, this is important because we have to establish, one, they're telling us that this book, the Bible, is old. It's giving us the recorded history from start to finish. How is it not mentioning the Sumerians? And we understand why it's not mentioning the Sumerians, because the Sumerian civilization wasn't discovered until the mid-19th century. We're talking about the 1850s. After 1850 is when they first discovered the Sumerian civilization, which we know, of course, the powers that be already knew. Now it says here, the ancient Sumerians, the black-headed ones, lived in the southern part of what is now Iraq. The heartland of Sumer lay between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers and what the Greeks later called Mesopotamia. This territory, once skillfully irrigated, proved very fertile, and major cities had long been in existence before the period when archaeologists can identify the Sumerian people themselves. The Sumerians were characteristically inventive and are likely to have been responsible for the development of the first writing well before 3000 BCE. Sumerians were recording their language using simple pictures. They wrote on tablets of clay, later evolving the script that to us is known as cuneiform or wedge-shaped. Now, real quick, one of the things I get into, I always talk about Ethiopians, just talk about, the whole out of Africa thing. You got to remember, like I said, when these people basically came from out of hiding, it's something had happened. And we have this whole migration that's supposed to have taken place. Whatever that was, as I said, the civilization that followed the Nile up to Egypt, when they got there, those pyramids was there. Just that simple. Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure was there. Great Pyramids was already there. But you had a time frame where people was doing expeditions to the Middle East to try to validate the Bible. And for a long time they was going there. We know these expeditions was taking years. And they find stuff and they got to excavate that take even more years, especially so long ago. But a lot of people don't understand. It was a whole time where they were going out to try to validate the Bible. People was, obsessed with it to go out in history and find these places to try to validate the book. And they went out and they, this is when we start uncovering everything. This is where you have Champollion and all these French archaeologists and researchers or what have you going out trying to validate religion. Now you've seen in the video, it's talking about Jupiter, talking about what happened, this whole collision and everything like that. So this is important to understand, maintain that information. So biggest part, we got to understand, where did this stuff come from? Because a lot of people have this idea that what we've been told about the Sumerians and the whole story about Enki and Enlil, everything about the Sumerian tablets and all this information about the Anunnaki is just this really ancient information that's been around for a long time. And it's because the Sumerian, civilization is so old, people just automatically couple the two, not realizing what they're saying and what's going on and what's been put out about this information. And you have to understand, it's one man, Zecharia Sitchin, that 1979, he came out with his book, and he's the one who put out all this information. But it's all him. And the more you dig into it, the more you figure out exactly what happened. But it's real easy to see, who this guy is. I know you guys already know about masonry and everything like that, and who he's affiliated with in the story, but people don't know how deep this is. Now, this is a thing that has almost gotten out of hand, and it's like no mediator there to step up and be like, hey, y'all need to stop dealing with this shit because this is the truth. This is what's happening, because a lot of people is so fixated on the story and it sounds so believable, but they don't understand how they're coupling Sitchin's story with the truth, and they don't go together. You're coupling what Sitchin put out with the information they found on the Sumerians, and it's just not the same. It's two totally different stories. His story is completely fabricated. So you got to understand, it's Sitchin. It's his story that a lot of you guys are believing that is at the forefront of this Anunnaki stuff. So here it says, just real quick, easy. When you go to his Wikipedia, it says Zecharia Sitchin was an author of a number of books proposing an explanation for human origins involving ancient astronauts. Sitchin attributed the creation of the ancient Sumerian culture to the Anunnaki, which he stated was a race of extraterrestrials from a planet beyond Neptune called Nibiru. Okay? It says here, Sitchin's ideas have been resoundingly rejected by scientists, academics, historians, including Sumerianologists, Orientalists, and Assyrianologists, and anthropologists, who dismiss his work as pseudoscience and pseudo-history. His work has been criticized for flawed methodology, ignoring archaeological and historical evidence, and mistranslations of ancient texts, as well as for incorrect astronomical and scientific claims. American biblical scholar Michael S. Heiser states he has found many inaccuracies in Sitchin's translations and challenges interested parties to use this book to check their validity. Professor Ronald H. Fritz, author of the book Invented Knowledge, False History, Fake Science, and Pseudo-Religions, mentions the example of Sitchin's claim that the Sumerian sign, whatever this is, means pure ones of the blazing rockets, adding that Sitchin's assignment of meanings to ancient words is tendentious, which basically means you're trying to make it controversial, and frequently strained. Fritz also commented on Sitchin's methodology, writing that when critics have checked Sitchin's references, they have found that he frequently quotes out of context or truncates, which means basically like to shorten his quotes in a way that distorts evidence in order to prove his evidence is presented selectively and contradictory evidence is ignored. Sitchin bases his arguments on his personal interpretations of Egyptian and Sumerian texts. In the seal VA-243, Sitchin wrote that these ancient civilizations knew of a 12th planet when in fact they only knew of 5. Hundreds of Sumerian astronomical seals and calendars have been decoded and recorded, and the total count of planets on each seal has been 5. Seal VA-243 has 12 dots that Sitchin identifies as planets. When translated, seal VA-243 reads, "You're his servant," which is now thought to be a message from a nobleman to a servant. According to Heiser, the so-called sun on the seal VA-243 is not the Sumerian symbol for the sun, but is a star, and the dots are also stars. The symbols on seal VA-243 has no resemblance to the hundreds of documented Sumerian sun symbols. Okay, real quick. This is, seal VA-243. You guys have seen this before when you've seen Sitchin showing this. Now, the whole thing with this is, he wants to say that, you have the sun in the middle, which us today will look at it and say, yeah, that's the sun, and that's planets around it. Now, they're telling you from everything they found with the Sumerians. And this is another thing you got to understand. Like, there is about, you can count them on one hand. There's about 3 or 4 people on the planet, the entire world, that can read Sumerian. And it takes so much to do it. Sitchin is supposedly self-taught. Any one of those people who can actually read ancient Sumerian, I tell you, he don't know a lick. He don't know what he's talking about. He don't understand. They're all on video. A lot of them came out and spoke about this, and I just read some of the stuff that they had to say. But the man is bonkers when it comes to a lot of the stuff. But the seal will get most people, because you'll look at it and you'll see clear as day, that looks like the sun. What else could it be? And, they're telling you everything that they found as far as the symbols for the sun, that's not it when you have these dots around it. Something completely different. So what we know, you got to understand, everything in the ancient world, when we're talking about the Bible, everything that's in the Old Testament, as I said before, is dealing with Saturn. Saturn as being the primary sun, plain and simple. And this is what it's talking about. So the Sumerians exclusively dealt with Saturn, plain and simple. They dealt with Saturn. So even when you go into the Bible, when it's talking about Remphian, as I showed you guys before, even in the book of Acts, and you got to think about the Old Testament, the gods that they was worshiping, Moloch, the bull calf god, and Baal, all of it has to go back to Saturn, plain and simple. So this is really this. Now, when you see it, it makes more sense. That's Saturn in the middle. And then he said, what I just read, that those are not planets, those are stars. So what do you see that is showing you around Saturn is constellations, which would be stars. It's not our sun. So when you look at the ancient symbols, I showed you guys these before, you can clearly see 3, figures. You got sun, you got a moon, and you have another sun. As I talked about before, we had 2 suns. Every ancient civilization that's ancient is talking about this. This is what they depicted. We have even older references showing 2 suns and the moon. So you even have it before when it's just 2 suns. And you have ancient civilizations referring to a time where there wasn't no moon, and the moon just, came out of nowhere. This is why you had the book Who Built the Moon. It's really weird. So as you've seen in the story, that, Earth, supposedly a satellite or a moon of Saturn. And this was during human time when people could actually see this, and something happened. Now, that something that happened to me is what caused this, this fall of man, they would say, or this, whatever caused man to go in hiding or go underground or go wherever we went when this catastrophe obviously happened. So everything changed for whatever reason. So this is kind of sort of where history picks up on. So if you take it back to Genesis and you see that, okay, it's really talking about, the fall, Saturn falling as a sun, Jupiter being God. I showed you guys all this about Jupiter being God and everything like that. And then we have this beginning of civilization, which Genesis, not realizing that, it was civilizations before us, kind of sort of hinting, in a esoteric way to Genesis 1, where you have people that was created before Adam and Eve. And that's esoteric as well, as I got into. But it kind of works both ways. But you got to look at that. So what you have with the Sumerian Empire, this connection with Saturn, and we see it. And same thing as we go up. So we got to realize that a lot of these beings they're talking about is representing Saturn, has to deal with this stuff. So Old Testament, it's all Saturn worship. Just that simple. And then you start putting together with the Old Testament being Jewish, with the Jews, talked about this. And you have, the black robes, the square of Saturn, the tefillin that they wear, all the stuff goes back to Saturn, all that stuff. So, if Saturn is Satan, and then we have the evil God of the Old Testament, and everybody swears this, oh, well, Satan was God. He was evil Old Testament. Something was wrong with God back then. And then we have Jesus in the New Testament representing the sun we see today, which, Saturn will be the dark sun, they call it, the black sun. This is what they want to hide from us. So the truth, when we start really getting into the Sumerian Empire, ancient Sumeria, this is what we're going to find. You're going to find black-faced people. black people. And then one of the main things that they got into that we see the most talking about with the Sumerians is them talking about beings coming down. Now, Sitchin, if you follow, this whole Anunnaki thing, he's saying that, that the Bible comes from Sumeria. It's one of the things he's saying that the Nephilim, the Nephilim is basically the Anunnaki. He's trying to make the Anunnaki the Nephilim in the Old Testament. And that, the Bible basically comes from Sumeria, which, this is one of the things. Whenever people say stuff like that, like, I only agree with the Old Testament, New Testament is bad. Or, oh no, Jesus was black, they changed it. They didn't want to put it in there. They took out all the black stuff out the Bible. Or they say anything derogatory about the Bible. This wasn't in there. They changed this and that. But then they still believe in the book, which don't make sense. So you believe that they went in there to change something in the Bible to deceive you. Why would you believe the rest of the book? That tarnishes the whole book. Oh, they took out something that they didn't want there to deceive you, but they gave you the truth because they want you to have the truth. If they wanted you to have the truth, they would have left it in there in the first place, or they wouldn't change anything at all. So why would you believe anything in the book? So when people say, hey, this is where the stuff really comes from, why would you still believe it? So you have a lot of black people that's like, okay, well, we believe that they took stuff from Egypt, but the rest of it was good. Or we believe that the book was used for good, but just by bad people. But then they believe all the hocus pocus stuff that's in the book. And they believe that God got them a car, God saved their life, God got them off drugs and everything like that. But God didn't do anything to punish the people that used the book for evil during slavery. Nothing got done to them. So they got rich. They bloodlines got stinking rich off of us. So you pick your poison, but it's one of those things. But Sitchin, it's clear as day, he's trying to piggyback on the Bible, and he's trying to fit this whole thing into history. You got to understand that it's him. Now, he sold millions of books, and that's why he's stuck, because he was able to tell a story, and that's what they're good at. Jupiter becomes a demiurge, or the demiurge, however you want to pronounce it. Jupiter is the demiurge. What is the demiurge? And it says here, a being responsible for the creation of the universe. In Platonic philosophy, the maker or creator of the world. That's important. In Gnosticism and other theological systems, a heavenly being subordinate to the supreme being that is considered to be the controller of the material world and antagonistic to all that is purely spiritual. So we just read that Jupiter is the demiurge, right? And how do you become a demiurge? To be a demiurge, you have to be a creator god. You have to have created the world. So Jupiter created this planet. And it says here in Scientific American, a new study, however, suggests that without Jupiter, Earth itself might not exist either. Where this and the other rocky planets now orbit, there may have first been a previous generation of worlds destined to be bigger, gas-shrouded, utterly uninhabitable orbs. But Jupiter came swinging in, clearing the way for small worlds like Earth by destroying those older planets. The study, co-authored by California Institute of Technology, planetary scientists, whatever. Now it says here, it is understood, and this is from David Topper, it is understood that Velikovsky believed the Earth and Saturn to have once moved in close proximity, with the Earth perhaps revolving as a Saturnian moon. The Saturn myth proposes that Saturn, fixed at the celestial pole, loomed massively overhead a central sun venerated by all mankind. Evidence is presented there for a Saturnian polar configuration as the source of early civilization's dominant symbols. Velikovsky believed and argued that Jupiter and Saturn were most likely part of the binary system of stars because of the outstanding position of Saturn in the ancient world. As Velikovsky claimed, Saturn was probably closer to Earth and more of Jupiter at the time. So now understand, saying here, did the Great Flood actually occur? An already open question for today's disputes. According to Velikovsky's research, he did not just happen. This did not just happen. But also, through the fault of Saturn and his giant space neighbor Jupiter. In the above mentioned book, Worlds in Collision, Velikovsky argued that Saturn and Jupiter came very close to each other, being on orbital paths that differed from the current ones. And then it was supposed that two bodies, such as Jupiter and Saturn, came close together, causing severe perturbations and powerful tidal effects in the atmosphere. Being a system of binary double stars, they could interact to such an extent that they would lead to a stellar explosion. Velikovsky suggested that an event placed the planets in the place that we see today and launched a chain of events that resulted in a flood on the Earth. People that remembered early tragedies enacted in the sky by the heavenly bodies asserted that Jupiter drove Saturn away from its place in the sky before Jupiter Zeus became the chief god. Saturn, Kronos, occupied the celestial throne. In all ancient religions, the dominion passes from Saturn to Jupiter. So now, you just go back, let's look at Genesis. Genesis, God created the earth. So who created the earth? What created the earth? God. What was it telling you? Jupiter. Just read to you. Jupiter. Because of Jupiter, the earth was created. So in the beginning, God created the earth. Jupiter. So then what happened? You had something happen on the planet and God got pissed and caused the flood. But what caused the flood? Jupiter. Now you gotta bounce back and forth between stories. In the mix of this, what's supposed to have taken place? Saturn, which is Satan, fell. There was a war in heaven. Just told you, Jupiter and Saturn. So the fall of Saturn is the fall of Satan, caused by God. God is who? Jupiter. Jupiter caused Saturn to fall as being a star. It's telling you what Saturn is Satan. And then again, Jupiter causes this flood. Who causes the flood in the Bible? God. It's Jupiter it's talking about. And it says here, in alchemy, Saturn symbolizes lead, which is the base form of gold. This is to symbolize the fall of Saturn, who was once a golden sun, but has been reduced to base materials. Understand what it's saying? Base materials. This is the tale of two suns. As Saturn's energy is siphoned away by Jupiter, it is shot out like bolts of plasmic lightning. Zeus, Jupiter, lightning bolts. Some say these hit a planet, which then becomes the sun as it explodes into life. Others that these sparks of divine essence from the new sun on their own. So now understand, Jupiter is the son of Saturn. As he said, he was taken down by his sons. Jupiter is the son of Saturn. But, you have now, this conundrum. Where does this come from? And it's basically giving you, what it's talk about in Gnosticism, where you have what, Jupiter being the son of Saturn and Jupiter being God, the creator of this world. Where do we see this? We see this with the demiurge and Sophia. Sophia creates the demiurge. You understand? So we have Saturn creating Jupiter, which created this world, son of Saturn. And then we have with Sophia creating the demiurge, which the demiurge in Gnosticism created this world, trapped us in flesh. What happened with Saturn? They trapped him in the cube, which is materialism. This is all symbolism. It's going to make a lot of sense if it don't already. We have the same thing with Mary. And as you can see with this book here, that's what they're trying to allude to. But you also have with Saturn, the Satan aspect, which for, with Sophia, that would be the demiurge. And we would look at the demiurge as being, evil. And then we go back and look at, well, wait a minute. How do you tie this together with Jupiter? If Jupiter created the earth, which we're here because of that, then that means God is evil. So then you got to understand and look back. Well, wait a minute. So we had a golden age where everything was going great. And that was under Saturn. So how can Saturn be Satan and the evil one? So then you start to understand Satanism and why the occult is, this way, and why all of the Saturn worship, which is deeper than this. That's old knowledge. The whole Jupiter, Saturn, the Genesis part that you just saw, that I talked about. That's esoteric knowledge. That's masonry. That's stuff they know about. So that stuff he knew about, that he knew the rest of the world, for the most part, had no clue what they're talking about with the fall being of Saturn and, by the hands of Jupiter or what have you, this whole clashing of the planets that showed you Velikovsky is talking about. And we can see how Sitchin piggybacks off of that. And it says here, according to Sitchin, Nibiru, whose name was replaced with Marduk in original legends by the Babylonian ruler of the same name in an attempt to co-opt the creation of himself, collided catastrophically with Tiamat, a goddess in the Babylonian creation myth, the Anunnaki, which he considers to be another planet once located between Mars and Jupiter. This collision supposedly formed the planet Earth, the asteroid belt, and the comets. Sitchin states that when struck by one of the planet Nibiru's moons, Tiamat split in two. And then on the second pass, Nibiru itself struck the broken fragments, and one half of Tiamat became the asteroid belt. Think about that. The second half, struck again by one of Nibiru's moons, was pushed into a new orbit and became today's planet Earth. Sitchin also speculated that Pluto, which he identifies as both Gaga and Ismad, was originally a satellite of Saturn, but Nibiru's gravity perturbed it, sending it to the outer solar system and giving the body its peculiar orbital path, intersecting the orbit of Neptune. So people didn't know that stuff. People had no clue back then about this information. A lot of this stuff just started coming out once we got the internet. But Sitchin knew because he's a Mason. So he understood, the esoteric, genesis of the Bible. And as you can see, Sitchin's story clearly coincides with what we just showed you with Velikovsky and its collision between Jupiter and Saturn. So clear as day, what's going on. You can get into the story if you want to. You can read about Enki and Enlil. It's the same. Just like we have Egyptian mythology, just like we have Greek mythology and Roman mythology, the Sumerians had mythology. Now you got to think about who gave us these mythological stories, because you're not going to hear it the way that it was meant to be heard. You're going to get a watered down, esoteric part given to us by the Greeks. Same thing with Egyptians, same thing with Greeks, same thing with Roman and everybody else. We don't know, because we can't go back there and, read the language. But we got to understand, again, universal law, that they have to give us some truth. But Sitchin is a Mason. And he's embarked on, when he put this out, he's passed now, I believe, 2010. But he was embarking upon what they call the great work. And this is just something that has to be done to reach 33rd degree of Freemasonry. And the great work is basically exactly what he did. It's doing something, whatever that great work, you agree upon or you decide to undertake or what have you. This was his great work. And it was putting this out. And he succeeded in doing what he wanted to do. And you don't get, this is one of the things you got to think about. He's a Jewish guy. Just think about you trying to self-educate yourself in the toughest, dead, hard language ever to learn on your own, but to be able to learn it, supposedly learn it, and to have the audacity to write books on it and have your book accepted and have millions of people buy it and have press and all these people knowing who you are. How is it possible for you to get this type of attention off of a story that nobody can corroborate, that sounds crazy, that goes against the archaeology, goes against the science, go against astrology? But this dude is able to put it out there. And it's because the people who are running these fields, who is up there and have the power, are in the same group as him. Masons. Same people. So he gets the criticism because that's what they do. You see it on the news all the time. It's like, okay, well, these major companies, they tell on themselves. Because at the end of the day, the people who matter at the top are not going to jail. They own the jails. So they can tell on the CEO or whoever they got to run the company if they did something, or they put the fall on them, send them off. Meanwhile, the true owners, nothing ever happens to these people. But you see it on the news all the time, them throwing each other under the bus because they have to keep things up, keep the appearances up. to make it look like they can be held accountable for stuff when they're not. So these people tap dance around the truth. They could put out whatever. And people just eat it and believe Sitchin and believe this work and wanted more books. And he put them out. And Stitchin's whole thing was, selling books, selling tours to Africa, which he got crazy money off doing, to tell a story that never happened. Now, I don't understand why people desperately want to believe this story, especially how absurd it is. It's stupid. The real Sumerians, like I said, one of the main things he talked about was extraterrestrial. We know about the fish-like creatures, was the Ones, and the Sumerians talked about these beings coming down and giving knowledge to them. And it's funny because you have the same type of story from the Dogon, saying the same type of fish-type headed creatures came down and gave them information, and that's where they came from. So you got to look at both civilizations. It's like, whoa, they have an identical story now. And that's good. So you have this, you got this information, and it's distorted. They don't want to get into that deeply because we're going to get into too much of the truth. So Sitchin, okay, it's almost a huge cover up. Well, it is a huge cover up. You come in, you give us a good story that's going to detract from the truth. So you want to believe that, okay, Inky and Enlil, this whole thing was about basically a rebellion of the people who was working on the planet, and they was tired of being worked so hard, and they wanted them to basically create something that was going to help them out, which they took the Homo sapiens and genetically modified them to mine gold. Now, if you have the capability of genetically modifying Homo sapiens and to just be able to travel planets, you got the capability to get gold with no problem, to build robots, to, this is advanced civilization we're talking about here. You don't make something as complex as us to mine gold. It's overkill. It's stupid.